This is Audible.
Audible Studios presents Sanctuary, written by DJ Molay, performed by Christian Rummel.
Prologue. Shay did not want the thing that came out of her. It did not summon within her even the tiniest breath of maternal instinct. Not like she'd felt in all those years working as a midwife, all those times when newborns would cry and tremble and nestle into their mothers and make Shay's ovaries feel like they were tying themselves in knots. But this was not a baby. This was a thing, an it. She hated it, and had begun to hate it the second she'd felt it moving in her violated womb. And perhaps even before that. Perhaps she'd even begun to hate it when she'd missed her period only 4 months ago. 4 months? How was that even possible? How was this thing even possible? None of her experience in midwifery had prepared her for this, not the strange, abbreviated, and agonizing pregnancy, and not the abomination that it had brought out of her. She had always wanted to have a baby of her own. She just never found the right guy to settle down with. As her 30s had crept towards her 40s, she'd considered artificial insemination. But she'd kept holding out for that right guy to come along. Kept putting it off, and then it was too late. The plague came, and society and all of its medical marvels went away. 9 out of 10 people were infected by it and turned into animals. Or at least that's how they acted. It burrows through the frontal lobe, they'd said, those few newscasters that had been holding out for some real scientific information on the plague, instead of the rampant speculation they'd been vomiting for 2 months straight. And then there was no more news. The plague burned itself out within a year. But by then, the damage had already been done. There was no going back. And Shay had to concern herself with survival and let the long-held dream of being a mother die, stillborn in her chest. Stillborn, which is what this thing should have been. 4 months, she thought again, bewildered, sweating, and in shock, a shock both physical and mental. Deliriously, she remembered her own cutesy, sing-song voice, telling expectant mothers that at 4 months their little darling was about the size of an avocado. But the thing that had grown inside of her had done so with alarming speed, and painfully, stretching her insides in ways that the human body was not evolved to handle. She'd bled almost constantly as a result. At 2 months, her distended belly looked like that of a woman 6 months pregnant. At 3 months, she looked full term, which was impossible, and yet it had happened. Impossible that the thing that came out of her should be alive, but it was. And more than that, it was developed far beyond what a newborn human should be. It did not cry. It yipped like a small dog. It did not squirm helplessly about. It was already crawling, the umbilical cord still tethered to Shay. The thing opened fully functioning eyes and took in its environment with a dazed sort of curiosity. A mutant, Shay thought, gasping with revulsion and jerking her leg violently away from the creature as it laid one of its grossly long-fingered hands on her skin. A mutant, just like all the other mutants currently huddled around her, barking and growling and muttering. Because the plague had not just burrowed through the frontal lobe, it had also done something to their genetics. Lengthened their arms, hardened their flimsy human nails into dog-like claws, widened their jaws, extended their teeth. A flash of lightning lit the rain-swept night outside. It strobed across the bestial faces of the mutants huddled around her, illuminating their eyes like spotlighted animals. And she saw him coming through their midst. The king mutant himself, Khan. She thought of him as that because he reminded her of Shere Khan, the bad-tempered tiger from the Jungle Book, massive and cruelly muscled, skin far blacker than Shay's own brown complexion, so that he was just a huge shadow that loomed large, frightening the other mutants out of his way with little more than a deep growl and a rumbling chuff. He wanted to see what Shay had produced. Wanted to see the thing that had come out of her, because he'd been the one that had forced it into her. And for that, she hated him more than all of the others that had kept her captive these long, nightmarish months. And it made her hate the thing she'd birthed even more. The body that Shay had been leaning against shifted as Khan moved through the darkness towards her. She tried to brace herself to keep her head from hitting the stone floor, but pain lanced through her abdomen when she activated the stretched and ruined muscles of her core. She cried out and collapsed backward, the impact to the back of her skull setting her ears to ringing. It was the queen bee that she'd been leaning against. No, not bee as in honeybee. Bee as in bitch, for that is what Shay called the creature in her mind. The queen bitch. Sometimes even said it to her face, though she didn't know how much language the queen bitch understood. Sometimes she seemed to understand a lot, other times not so much. Queen inserted herself between Khan and the thing still scrambling unsteadily about between Shay's legs. Khan halted with a throaty grunt. Queen scooped up the newly birthed creature, pulling it away from Khan and forcing it into Shay's unwilling arms. Then she turned and planted herself in front of Khan, sitting on her haunches as though to block his path. Shay drew her head back, horrified as the thing that had come out of her thrust its malformed face into hers, its oddly adult-like hands pawing at her. She did not want this thing, would sooner abandon it than nurse it. Not that she could, as her confused body had produced no milk. Then she thought about killing it with her own hands, felt revolted by her own desire to do so, but couldn't deny the relief she would feel if it was no longer alive. A deep, threatening growl snapped Shay's attention back to Khan. Seemed it had the same effect on Queen, because she wilted a bit as Khan stood up to his full, towering height, his long, thick arms swaying back and forth, the tips of his clawed fingers raking the stone-tiled floor. "No, go away," Shay wanted to scream. "Don't let him get close to me." But she knew better than to get loud when Khan was there. The fact that he hadn't ripped her apart already was, Shay knew, a miracle. She was nothing to him. Nothing but a womb that had fulfilled its usefulness to him, and now, perhaps, she was just something to eat. She knew that he had only kept her alive this long because he wanted the thing she'd just given birth to. Or at least wanted to see what it was, male or female. Shay hadn't even noticed, had no desire to check. For 4 months, her presence had only barely been tolerated by him, though Queen seemed to have developed a sort of affection for Shay and would often lay with her and groom her and mutter soft syllables that had no meaning to Shay's ears. But Queen's apparent affection for her did not mean she would risk Khan's rage. Khan and all the other males in the troop obeyed their matriarch seemingly out of instinct. But Khan was still the alpha, and the balance of power between him and Queen Bee was complex to the point of often feeling fragile. And at this moment, Khan's curiosity was insistent. It held the threat of violence. Perhaps it was Shay's own birthing screams that had gotten the troop so riled. Perhaps it was the scent of blood and afterbirth in the air. But the tensions were high, and the natural order of the matriarchy seemed a flimsy thing now. If Queen didn't get out of Khan's way, he was going to hurt her. And apparently Queen knew that too, because she snarled at him but shuffled to the side. On he came, lowering back down to all fours. Shay didn't dare to move, didn't even dare to look him in the eye. She had learned a lot over the 4 months of being held captive by these beasts. Learned a lot about how not to piss them off. Khan snatched the thing out of Shay's arms, causing it to squeal like a pig as he held it upside down from its legs. Then he sniffed it and looked at what was between its legs. A male, Shay noted distantly. Then Khan roared and flung the thing back at Shay. It yelped as it hit her in the chest, legs and arms scrambling, but seeming unhurt, only frightened. The huddled mass of mutants erupted into snarls and barks, jumping about and jostling violently into each other. Khan stormed away on all fours, thrashing through their midst, snapping at any other creature that got too close, though they all gave him a wide berth. He shot across the room to where there was something breakable, an old wooden chair, and smashed it to splinters in seconds. And then he was roaring and charging back at Shay, and she knew this was it. Knew this was when Khan was finally going to tear her apart, just like she'd seen him do to the other people she'd been with when they'd made the mistake of coming to this place. She cried out, shoving the newborn creature away from her, feeling the umbilical cord pulled taut, pain lancing through her belly. She didn't care. She kicked with her legs, trying to get her shocked and exhausted body moving again. But then Queen was there again. She stood right in Khan's path and roared back at him, her teeth bared. Khan was not impressed, only more enraged. He slammed into Queen, smashed her to the ground, bit her savagely in the shoulder. And Shay knew that she was next, but she couldn't get her body moving again. Could only kick her legs and flail her arms, but the rest of her felt numb, paralyzed. Except her heart, that was thrashing violently, like another mutant thing that was trying to get out of her. But the second that Khan bit the troop's matriarch, something happened. Every female in the troop came hurtling in, jaws open wide, baring their teeth, snarling and barking. They surrounded Queen, and though they did not attack Khan, he drew back from their sudden ferocity and their sheer numbers. Yes, Khan could rage all he wanted, but the troop was still a matriarchy, and the females stuck together. Queen staggered to her feet, holding her injured shoulder, letting out a nasty hissing noise as she drew herself up. She and the dozen females stood their ground between Khan and Shay and the thing she had birthed. Khan's shock at being challenged dissipated in an instant, and he flew into another rage, but this one was impotent. He roared and thundered and pummeled his fists against his chest and then against the ground. Caught some unlucky male that had not retreated fast enough and hammered both massive fists down on the thing's back until it scrambled out of Khan's reach, yelping plaintively. Shay didn't know how it had happened, but she suddenly realized that the thing she'd birthed was cowering in her arms, mewling softly. And she was holding it, cradling it, shielding it from Khan's violence. She realized this, and she didn't let it go. Even when its worrying hands dug their little claws into the flesh of her breasts, even then she didn't let it go. Khan's fury eventually petered out, and he stood there on the other side of the protective wall of females, huffing and glaring at them. Gradually, the anxious hooting of the others tapered off, and all was silent, save for the distant grumble of thunder and the sound of the wind and the rain outside. Queen stood there for a moment longer, staring down the beast across from her. Then, very slowly and very deliberately, Queen raised her head and issued a long, eerie howl. Shay was no expert on all their strange vocalizations, even after being trapped with them for 4 months, but she'd heard this howl before. It meant that they were going places. The response was immediate from all save Khan and Queen herself. Every other creature that belonged to that troop went to all fours and began loping away, draining through the door on the other side of the room and out into the stormy night. Khan and Queen remained there for a moment longer, staring each other down. Breathlessly, Shay waited to see what Khan would do now that Queen was not protected by her retinue of females. But the howl had been made, and there was some instinct in all of them that moved them to obey, even Khan. With one last snort and a giant huff, he spun and dashed after the others and out of the room. Then it was just Queen and Shay and the thing in her arms, which had fallen silent save for its soft breathing, warm and moist in the crook of Shay's neck. The Queen bitch turned and looked at Shay for a long moment, and Shay did not know how to interpret that look. It was too dark to see much besides the whites of Queen's eyes, but another pale flash of lightning lit her face, and in that tiny little glimpse, Shay could have sworn she saw something like sadness. Queen offered one low hoot, almost mournful, almost as though to say, "Goodbye, friend." And then she was gone with the others. And it was just Shay and the thing that had come out of her. The thing she didn't want. The thing now nestled in her arms. The thing which Shay still had not let go of. Chapter 1. "Oh, motherfucker," Bran wheezed, jerking to a stop, one arm around Kat, leaning on her. Well, let's just be honest. She was holding up most of his weight. Kat tried to pull him back into motion, but he hissed and planted his feet. Wait, he begged, the hand not slung over Kat's shoulders, cupping the wound in his side, wincing against the constant ache that had, over the course of the last few miles, begun to stab viciously. "I gotta take a break," he ground out. Kat huffed. "Big man, baby," she growled in that low, raspy voice of hers. "I liked you better when you weren't such a chatterbox," he groaned. Kat stopped trying to pull him along, issued a soft grunt instead of halting words. Bran, wincing so hard his eyes were squinched shut, now peeled them open to give her a sidelong look. He was worried that he'd hurt her feelings with that comment, which was a very strange thing to be worrying about at that particular moment, because he was also very much worried that he was on the cusp of passing out and never waking back up. For all the fact that she was pretty much effortlessly supporting a grown man, Kat was not large, about average for a young woman. She had an athletic build, but that wasn't enough to explain her preternatural strength and endurance. But one look at her face and anyone could connect the dots. Pretty auburn hair, now lank with sweat and speckled with bits of leaves and sticks from sleeping in the Oregon woods the last few nights. Or were they still in Northern California? Bran was pretty sure they'd made it into Oregon by now, but that was beside the point. Kat's eyes were pretty too, large and nicely shaped and amber-colored. And that's where things became unfortunate. The lower half of her face protruded slightly into something akin to a muzzle, her nose flat and her mouth wide and thin-lipped, the corners of it reaching too far back to be normal, practically to her jaws. Breathing a bit heavily through her mouth at the moment, Bran could see her teeth, spread a little further and grown a whole lot longer than what would be considered normal, particularly the upper and lower canines. Kat was a hybrid, part human and part mutated apex predator. Some people called those predators infected. Other people called them crazies. Recently, Bran had heard the term primals applied to them, to distinguish them from the other people that had been infected and gone crazy, but hadn't gone through the strange macroevolution that had changed their appearance into something ape-like and vicious. As a mix, 3/4 human and 1/4 primal, Kat was not as malformed as a full-blooded primal would be. For a time, she'd worn a bandana around her nose and mouth to hide the deformity, and save for her pointed fingertips and hardened claw-like nails, it was easy enough to pass her off as a regular human. But she wasn't a regular human, and that was why she'd been able to pretty much carry Bran's ass for the last 2 days, as they'd struggled their way north through a seemingly endless forest. She waited patiently for Bran to catch his breath. He peeled his hand away from the wound in his torso and looked down at it, cringing. The bullet had entered at the back of his hip and gone out the front. No organ damage, thank God, and Bran had a bottle of amoxicillin tablets that had staved off infection. But infection wasn't the only thing that could kill you. Bran hadn't realized until recently how much he used his torso simply in the act of walking, which they'd been doing a lot of. And with all of that walking and unconscious torso twisting in the process, the wound had never had a chance to really close, and it wouldn't stop bleeding. Just a slow, dark, venous ooze which had soaked his left pant leg down to the knee. He'd pretty much been slowly bleeding to death for 5 days. Add to that the fact that he hadn't eaten and was severely dehydrated, and you can understand why Bran felt his empty grave yawning behind him, seeking to reclaim its escapee. And he supposed he had Kat to thank for helping him escape the grave. But much like prison, just because you escaped it, that didn't mean it wasn't still looking for you. Plus, it was fucking hot, and damn humid. And there was something grossly unjust about that, how the air could be so moist and yet his mouth feels so damn dry. Bran took a few more breaths, in through the nose, out through the mouth, trying to quell the prickly, hot-cold feeling of looming unconsciousness. He cracked a single wincing eyelid and peered ahead of them into the dappled shade of the muggy afternoon woods. "You're positive?" he sighed.
"Positive,"
Kat husked. "Well, how much fucking farther?"
"Not far."
She'd been saying not far for the past 3 miles, and still no sign of the white building she'd claimed to have spotted on a distant hillside. They just needed a place to hole up for a while so Bran could stop moving, and hopefully let the wound in his side seal up. Oh, and he also had another bullet hole that had gone in the back of his shoulder and out right where his pectoral muscle connected to his armpit. But that one had been easy enough to immobilize with a sling made out of Bran's shirt. Unfortunately, his unclothed upper body was now riddled with a bajillion mosquito bites. "You sure there's people there?" Bran asked, wondering even as he said it if people being there was a good thing or not. Most folks were not okay with Kat once they realized what she was, and that happened pretty quick if she wasn't wearing the bandana over her nose and mouth, and she'd apparently decided she didn't care to wear it anymore. Kat sighed gruffly and gave him a little tug, trying to spur him into motion.
"Yes, people."
With the arm she wasn't using to hold Bran up, she pointed to her nose.
"Smell them. Close."
Well, there was only one way to know if they'd be welcomed or kicked to the curb, and that was to get their asses moving and find out. So on they went. And lo and behold, and thank the heavens, another half-mile of agonized hiking brought them to the edge of a massive clearing in the middle of the woods, beyond which Bran could see exactly what Kat had said. Except, Kat had said she'd seen a building. And this? What the fuck was this, anyways? Standing cautiously a handful of yards from the edge of the woods, Bran squinted at what lay before him. Adobe walls, clay tile roofs, arched windows, and a prevalence of crosses. "Is that a monastery?" Bran wondered. Kat didn't respond, and he wondered if she even knew the word. A monastery? With people in it? Bran thought the chances of a bunch of monks surviving this long was almost laughable. But then again, if there were some brown-robed monks, surely they wouldn't turn him away. Who knew? Shit had gotten really weird over the past 6 years since the plague had toppled society.
"Walk?"
Kat questioned him. Bran grimaced, but there wasn't much of a choice in the matter. He'd have to walk out there himself and meet whoever there was to meet. If he could make contact, he could ease them into the idea of accepting Kat, a hybrid that wasn't feral. But if they saw Kat right at the outset, one of 2 things was going to happen. Either they wouldn't come out to talk at all, or they'd let guns do the talking. Monks with guns, Bran thought, tiredly amused. Sounds like a bad movie. Well, nothing to it but to do it. "All right," he grumbled and unlimbered himself from Kat's support. Not having eaten and being dehydrated, Bran was pretty sure he'd lost at least 10 pounds of body weight over the last 5 days, weight he couldn't afford to lose in the first place. But when he stood on his own 2 feet, he still felt grossly heavy. He wobbled a bit, and his calves and quads immediately started cramping. He forced himself onward before his abused muscles decided on complete mutiny. With his left arm in the sling, he could only raise his right, but that would have to be good enough. He wasn't armed. Hopefully they'd be able to see that. He stilted on unwieldy legs, hissing and groaning all the way until he was clear of the woods and back into bright, uncomfortably hot sunshine. His pace was slow and cautious. "Hello?" he called out at the silent buildings, eyes flicking from window to window, waiting to see movement. Kat claimed to be able to smell human habitation, but this place sure looked abandoned. No sentries posted, and that was odd as hell. Pretty much everyone nowadays lived in some sort of settlement, and there were 2 options for keeping the primals off your backs. The first and most reliable option was to splice into some pre-existing sustainable power grid, such as a nearby solar or wind farm, and run high-voltage fencing around the entire perimeter of the settlement. The second, and much less reliable option, was to have a whole lot of guards with guns keep watch 24/7. Bran saw neither. So how in the hell were there even humans existing in this place? Maybe there weren't. Maybe Kat was mistaken. Or perhaps she really had smelled humans, but it had been residual scents from the road they'd crossed a few miles back, which had looked well-traveled, a notable oddity for this rural area. "Hello?" Bran called again, his voice hoarse. "Anybody home? I'm not a threat to anyone. I'm badly injured and I need a place to rest." He didn't resent the lack of response this garnered. Even if there were people there, he could appreciate their lack of compassion. If the shoe was on the other foot, and he was the one hunkered in a defenseless monastery, watching some stranger emerge out of the woods claiming to be wounded, he'd assume it was some sort of trick. "If there's anyone here," Bran continued loudly, "come out and talk to me. Otherwise, I'm gonna assume this place is abandoned," and then a few things happened, all in the same instant. He heard Kat shout from behind him, "Bran!" And when he spun, electric-hot pain shooting through his twisted torso, he saw a massive dark-skinned shape coming at him fast, on all fours. "Oh shit!" he managed to squeak, and then was hit by the thing. Primal, his mind screamed at him, panic blanking out the pain as his body flew end over end. When he stopped rolling, he immediately tried to start crawling away as fast as he could, which wasn't very fast at all. And he didn't get far. Something hit him in the side, right on his wound, forcing him over onto his back. He grunted, unable to even cry out in pain as the breath left his body. On his back, he saw the thing towering over him. The first thing he noticed was the teeth. Lips pulled back, exposing every single one of them. Savage eyes glaring down at him. Deeply brown-skinned and heavily muscled and... pants? Odd how, even when you're pretty sure you're about to have your throat ripped out, you can take in a detail like that and be genuinely curious about it. Because primals did not wear clothes. They preferred to run about as nature intended. Then Kat came flying out of nowhere. The creature standing over Bran barely had time to see her coming before she hit it hard in the chest, and despite the size difference, sent it sprawling backwards. That was right about the time that Bran realized the kick to his wounded side was more than his brain could really handle at that moment, and he saw darkness closing in from the edges of his vision, his skin and scalp getting that feeling like he was about to pass out. The creature that had tackled Bran skidded through the dirt and came up on all fours, as lithe as a panther, but didn't lunge back at Kat. Instead, it seemed perplexed, as Kat planted her feet defensively over Bran's fallen form and roared at his attacker. And looking at the two of them, facing each other down, Bran realized something else. Their faces. They were the same. Not completely human, but not completely primal either. "He's a hybrid too?" Bran wondered hazily, and then promptly passed out. Chapter 2. Daylight. Diffused, coming in through a window. Illuminating a room. Bran was in a room. He was indoors, and it was surprisingly cool. Not air-conditioned cool, but much better than outside. And he was lying on a bed, an actual, real bed, with a frame and a mattress and everything. He craned his head up to look down at himself. He could feel that he was naked, but had a thin white sheet covering him. The room was neither spacious nor cramped. Enough space for the bed in which Bran lay, a simple wooden chest of drawers, and a simple wooden chair. A square, maybe 15 feet on a side. The walls were adobe. The monastery. He was inside the monastery? That was both highly alarming and somewhat hopeful. He briefly wondered if it was the same day that he and Kat had happened upon the monastery, but he had a dim sense of time having passed. Cloudy memories came back to him, waking to find someone working on him. A human. Full human. A woman with brown skin and black hair pulled out of her face. She spoke soft words that Bran could barely hear as she labored over his wounds. Then, waking to find himself alone in the dark. Nighttime. waking again sometime later to that same lady putting a cup of water to his lips, which he drank greedily and then fell asleep again. Daytime again. Alone. Nighttime again. Cat standing in the shadows saying,
Bran? Awake?
And him saying, "Yeah, I'm awake," just before passing out again. And now, daytime again. So, unless he'd hallucinated those memories or dreamed them up, then at least a couple of days had passed. He leaned up, expecting horrendous pain, and it did hurt, but not near as bad as he'd expected. Pleasantly surprised, and now even more convinced that some time must have passed, Bran pulled the white sheet up and inspected the wound in his side. It was covered by a clean white bandage. No blood seeping through. He pulled the bandage up with a finger and found that the wound, or at least the exit wound on the side of his stomach, had been stitched shut. Safe to assume the entry wound had received the same treatment. "Well, I'll be damned," Bran murmured. Gingerly, he sat up, saw that the wound through his shoulder had been treated much the same, and he didn't feel that cloying heaviness of dehydration, though now that he was taking stock of himself, oh God, I'm fucking starving. The need for food hit him hard, almost made him start sweating, hunger and nausea coiling around each other in his guts. But as much as he wanted to find some food, there were more important things that needed to be handled first. Namely, where was Cat? Was she okay? And also, who the fuck were these people, and why had there been a hybrid here? Something about it bothered the hell out of him, and for a moment he couldn't put his finger on it. But as he swung his legs carefully out of the bed and touched the cool stone floor with his bare feet, the realization dawned on him. Not just a hybrid male. Admittedly, the hybridization between humans and primals was something of a new and unexplored concept for Bran. His experience with hybrids was only with Cat herself and, briefly, a sister of hers. But where Bran had come from, it was generally accepted as fact that hybrids were always born female. Some trick of genetics and chromosomes that Bran had never really put much thought into. If someone had told him 6 years ago that a plague would cause 90% of the human population to go apeshit, he wouldn't have believed it. Would have believed it even less if you tried to tell him that the plague was going to fuck around with people's genetics, and that some of them were going to go through some pretty sudden and drastic morphological changes, evolving into some hellacious off-branch of Homo sapiens. So Bran had long ago accepted that the universe didn't really give a shit about what he considered possible. Having accepted that, Bran was much less disbelieving of seemingly impossible things, and much more curious how the universe was going to kick him in the balls again. Sitting now, with his upper half exposed, Bran realized he was shivering a bit. He'd become so used to being hot all the time that even the simple insulation of the adobe walls had him feeling cold. He pulled the sheet up over his shoulders, huddling beneath it as he slowly stood, and froze, frowning. Something like voices hit his ears. But no, they were definitely voices. Children's voices, it almost sounded like, except there was something off about them. The usual rhythm of the English language was absent. But was that really that weird for kids? They were constantly running around, making weird noises and shit. At least, that's the impression that Bran got from his few dealings with them. He padded quietly to the door of the room, hesitated there, his hand reached out for the brass doorknob, but not touching it yet. Maybe it would be best if he stayed put. Whoever lived in this monastery, they seemed friendly enough, right? They'd stitched his wounds closed and given him water. More importantly, they hadn't killed him. And if his feverish dreams were to be believed, they hadn't killed Cat either. Also, he hadn't been restrained. So, friendly? Maybe. Probably. But, as has already been mentioned, the universe really seemed to enjoy kicking Bran in the balls for his misconceptions. So perhaps supreme caution was called for. Bran found it best not to trust anyone. He eased the door open, aware of creaking hinges, but it didn't creak. He gave himself a gap just big enough to stick his head through and peered out. A long, straight hallway that disappeared out of sight to the left. Along the hall, there were tall, arched openings at even intervals, beyond which Bran could see a courtyard of sorts. No glass in those openings. You could step right through them and be outside. An open-air corridor, then. The voices were clearer now, but he couldn't tell where they were coming from. He eased the door open a bit more, leaned out so he could peer down the hall, first to the right, no one there, and then down to the left where he could see an open door and a figure standing in it. That's where the voices were coming from, Bran was pretty sure. And now, with his head in the hall, they'd become clearer, and he realized that they were actually speaking. It was just that they were speaking over one another, so no single word could be clearly heard. Bran eased himself out of the room, trying to get a better angle on the figure in the doorway down the hall. He couldn't see much since the figure had its back to Bran and was partially obscured by the door. A red and white plaid shirt, dirty khaki pants. Whoever it was, they looked pretty big. Bran took one step further into the hall and planted his foot on a sharp stone. He only let out the tiniest hiss as he retracted his foot, but whoever was down that hall must have had ears like a bat, because they immediately whirled to look right at Bran. "Oh, fuck!" Bran gasped, realizing he was staring right at the impossible male hybrid that had attacked him when he'd approached the monastery. The second they locked eyes, the creature snarled and exploded out of the doorframe. Bran had a brief fantasy of trying to run back into his room, but there was only about 30 feet between them, and the thing was hauling at him on all fours, inhumanly fast. Bran didn't have a prayer, and knew that a door wasn't going to help him anyways if the thing really wanted him. So he did the only thing he could think of in the moment, which was incredibly dumb. He knew that, but it was all he had. He put up his fists. "You're an idiot," he decided, as the being that clearly desired to separate his head from his shoulders closed within 10 feet. "Elijah!" The voice sharp and commanding and feminine. The hybrid male stopped like an onrushing dog reaching the end of its chain. One pace away from Bran, whose upheld fists were now trembling in the air. His heart, briefly shocked into a pause, now started slamming with such force, Bran was pretty sure his wounds were going to start bleeding again just from the spike in blood pressure. The hybrid rose from all fours. A big boy. Bran himself was about 6 feet, and he was looking up at this bastard. Fist still held out in front of him like an old-timey boxer, as though that would do him one damn bit of good. Movement from down the hall. A figure erupted out of the room. A woman. The same woman he remembered nursing his wounds and giving him water. Bran slowly unclenched his fists. His voice came out a little shaky. Ma'am? Help?" The hybrid male's eyes twitched to Bran's now open hands, craned his neck forward just a bit, nostrils flaring as he scented them. "Elijah?" The woman's voice came again, not quite as sharp as before, but still very stern. "Don't hurt him. I just spent the last 3 days trying to patch him up, and you're not going to ruin all my hard work, are you?" Bran sucked a breath in, let it out. "Please don't ruin all her hard work." The hybrid, Elijah apparently, pulled his head back, his lips closing to hide his teeth, but his eyes still narrowed and glaring. He took a minuscule step back from Bran. Another figure came bursting out of the room down the hall. "Bran?" Throaty and rough. "Cat!" Bran said, feeling relief nearly double him over. "You all right?" Cat bounded down the hall, then slowed drastically as she neared Elijah. He heard her coming, gave more space between him and Bran, then turned, his back to one wall, while Cat turned her back to the other wall, and the two slowly eased around each other like a pair of gunslingers. "Elijah!" the woman snapped, now stalking down the hall towards them. "You knock it off right now! This is not how we behave!" Cat, now having circled around to Bran's side, put her hands on his shoulders and looked him up and down with a worried expression.
You okay?
Actually, that sudden jolt of adrenaline had him feeling pretty shitty. He found himself blinking rapidly to fight a growing sense of faintness. Guess he wasn't quite as hale and hearty as he'd thought he was. "Fine," he managed, still keeping an eye on Elijah. You okay? Are you hurt?"
No.
The woman stopped at Elijah's side, hands on her hips, looking every bit the pissed-off mom. She was black, as was Elijah, though not nearly as dark-skinned. She wore what looked like a man's clothing, a pair of jeans far too large for her, the cuffs rolled up and the waist folded and cinched with a braided belt, an oversized white t-shirt with the sleeves cut off and bottom cropped up. She glared at Elijah, and he seemed to wilt to half-size under that look. Then the woman's face softened and looked sorrowful.
"You know better than that," she practically whispered. "What are we supposed to do when we see red?"
Elijah managed to look a little sullen.
Count,
he said, the word awkward and unwieldy in his misshapen mouth. The woman's eyebrows arched.
"Well, do you need to count? Or are you calm now?"
Elijah cast a baleful look at Bran, then lowered his eyes to his own feet.
Calm.
Bran swayed in place. Kat's hands took him firmly, steadying him. The woman looked at him, concerned.
"You're Bran, right?"
Blinking. Yeah, but... Down the hall, more figures trickled out of the room. Children, of varying sizes, all of them with very human eyes and very inhuman jaws.
Oh, Christ,
Bran murmured, suddenly feeling sick.
Are they...
The woman bustled forward.
"I think you need to lie down again."
Chapter 3. Bran didn't exactly lie down again. He'd slept off his exhaustion and was a bit too keyed up, his mind running in 10 different directions trying to extrapolate what the hell he'd gotten himself into. So instead of lying down, he sat at the edge of the bed and squinted as though staring into a bright light while he took long, slow breaths until he felt more normal. You know, he'd chalked breathing exercises up to some hippie yoga bullshit, but he'd sure become an expert in them over the last few days, and hippy-dippy bullshit or no, they worked. He eyed the woman as she pulled the wooden chair out from where it sat in the corner of the room and posted it by Bran's bedside. Kat stood in front of the closed door as though guarding it. It was just them in the room. The woman sat down, moving with just a hint of tired age. She wasn't old, looked to be of an age with Bran, late 30s or early 40s. But as a 40-year-old himself, Bran had decided that once you hit 30, you were basically starting to die. The way she eased herself into the chair with a disgruntled sigh made him feel a bit of camaraderie with her. As much as he loved Kat, her tireless strength made him feel decrepit, so it was nice to see some evidence that he wasn't such a big man-baby after all. "All right," Bran said once he felt a little more like himself. Still had the sheet wrapped around him, hiding his nakedness. He wondered what she'd done with his clothes, but he'd get to trivial shit once he had a better idea of what the fuck was happening around here and where here might actually be.
First things first. Where are we?
She gave him an arched look.
"Hang on there, Mr. Man. We both got questions."
She crossed one knee over the other and leaned back, the chair creaking as she did.
"But the real first thing is that you're welcome for saving your life and patching you up."
Bran felt a little embarrassed about skipping over that. He nodded, his cheeks flushing a bit.
Right, yeah. Thank you for that.
"I'm Shay,"
she said, pressing a hand to her chest and saying it like he was a primitive that was being taught manners. Bran hesitated for a moment, eyeing her.
Okay. Good to meet you, Shay. That short for something? Or is it just Shay?
She smiled cautiously.
"It's Shayana, but everyone calls me Shay. It's easier for them to say."
Bran glanced at the door.
I'm assuming by everyone you mean all the hybrids running around? Or are there other,
how to say this without sounding offensive?
Normal folk?
Shit, that was still kind of offensive. Luckily, neither Kat nor Shay reacted to it. Shay shook her head slowly.
"No, it's just me and them here."
And here is...
"A monastery."
I gathered that. I mean, are we still in California or is this Oregon?
"This is Oregon. Is California where you came from?"
Bran briefly considered lying, but couldn't see the benefit in it.
Yeah. We left there 5...
He stopped himself. It had been 5 days when they'd come to the monastery. Now it was... How long have we been here? Earlier you said 3 days? Shay nodded. Well, then we left California 8 days ago. Shay gave a significant look in the direction of his abdominal wound.
That where you got shot?
Again, the instinct to lie. Experience had taught Bran to trust no one, even when they were seemingly friendly, because everyone had ulterior motives and they'd only help you if your interests merged. Playing your cards close to the vest gave you a better chance at not getting stabbed in the back when your interests diverged. But Bran was curious as hell to find out about Shay and what exactly she was doing out here in the middle of nowhere with a pack of young hybrids. One thing he'd noticed about those hybrids was that they were all dark-skinned like Elijah, and that gave him an uncomfortable notion. Were they her kids? And if they were, that meant this lady had a pretty weird fetish with some male primal out there, which made Bran think she might just be flat-out insane. But he didn't know any of that for sure, which meant there was going to have to be an exchange of information between them if Bran wanted to find out who he was actually dealing with here. And if he wanted the truth out of Shay, he couldn't very well tell her a bunch of lies. Well, he could, but then he'd feel like a bastard. And he was pretty tired of feeling like a bastard. He'd done a lot of dirty shit and was really trying to turn over a new leaf. No better time than a brush with death to try and become a new man. Besides, he didn't know how much Kat might have already told this lady. Sure, Kat could only manage a handful of words at a time, but she'd had 3 days, so... Yeah, he eventually admitted. California's where I got shot. She waited for him to expound. It's a long story, he tried.
You got someplace to be?
Shay asked pointedly.
Because I don't.
Bran sighed heavily and looked down at his bare feet. Maybe this was an opportunity. A chance to prove to himself he wasn't the shitheel he thought he was. Maybe if he started his new life with a bit of honesty, it would actually help instead of hurt. Me and Kat worked for a guy. He got into some bad shit. Some people took exception to it, and there was a lot of shooting. I stuck around when things went down because I felt I owed the guy some loyalty for getting me out of a tough situation once. But when he went down, I didn't really have a reason to keep fighting, so I got the hell out of there. He nodded towards his wounds. But not before getting tagged in the back. Shay pursed her lips and considered him for a few beats.
There's a lot to unpack there, Bran. Let me start at the top, because it's related to whether or not I'm comfortable with you staying here.
Bran sighed and slumped a bit. Well, if you were going to be honest, you might as well be honest all the way. Dirt and all. Fine, he grunted. Hit me. Shay leaned forward, her palms gliding slowly over each other.
You said the guy you worked for was into some bad shit. Does that mean you did some bad shit for him? And what kind of bad shit are we talking about?
Well, that pretty much did it. Bran was going to tell her, and then she was going to kick him the fuck out of there, and he couldn't even resent her for it. I'll tell you. But once I do, you're not going to want me around. And that's fine. But can I ask that you let me rest here for another few days? Heal up a bit more? Shay raised her eyebrows.
Wow. That bad, huh?
She let the question hang in the air, and it became apparent to Bran that she wasn't going to make any promises to him. He should have just lied. Well, to start from the top, Bran finally said, I'm a violent felon. The guy I worked for, his name was Colin, hired me out of work release from prison. That's why I felt I owed him some loyalty. Colin had a ranch with a shit ton of land. Once the plague went down, a bunch of folks started squatting on his land. He tolerated it for a while, and then he didn't. And it was my job to get them gone. I'd try to do it peacefully, but mostly it got violent. I hurt people. He swallowed. Killed them. From her position near the door, Kat fidgeted guiltily. Me too, she husked. Shay eyed them both, clearly disconcerted. But we're trying not to be those people anymore, Bran said. We're trying to change. Shay didn't look terribly convinced.
A lot of people say that a zebra don't change its stripes.
Bran looked at her sharply. Yeah, they do. But I ain't a fucking zebra. Shay leaned back again, rubbing the tops of her thighs.
All right,
She said uncertainly.
one more question, and then I'll return the favor. You've at least been honest with me, I guess. Don't know if there's more shady shit you're not telling me.
Aside from gory details, no. Shay gave him a flat smile.
Okay. You had a bottle of amoxicillin. I'm guessing that's the only reason your wounds weren't infected.
Bran allowed it with a nod. Some intense interest.
Where'd you get it?
Medicine in general, and antibiotics in particular, were nearly impossible to find nowadays, and had become so valuable that people didn't even trade them. If you had them, you were either one lucky son of a bitch that hit the jackpot while scavenging, or you'd killed someone to get them. In this particular instance, though, neither explanation was true. You remember the people I said took some exception to what my boss was doing? Shay nodded. They were military types, very well equipped. I don't know where they got all their stuff from, but that's where I got the antibiotics.
So you stole them from these military types?
Bran shook his head. No, they gave them to me. Shay frowned.
But they were the ones that shot you in the back, weren't they?
They were. But then Kat made a deal with them. Saved my life in exchange for her help getting a friend of theirs back. He scowled at the ground, remembering. They didn't have to give me the pills. Could have just sent me on my way. But they did anyways, despite the fact that I'd been their enemy.
And you realize that's pretty hard to believe, right?
Yeah, but it's the truth. Come on, Shay. You really think I'm gonna admit to being a violent felon and a... Oh boy, it was hard to even say the word. To admit it, even to himself. And a murderer? You think I'd admit to that, but lie about something as stupid as stealing medicine to survive? Shay was silent for a long, thoughtful moment. Then,
I don't know how to take you, Bran.
he smiled forlornly. Just another sad sap that waited too long to try to be a better person.
And are you a better person?
Hell if I know. It's only been 8 days, but I'm trying. Another long silence, which Bran was fairly certain would be broken by Shay telling them to beat feet, and she'd be entirely justified in doing so. One lady living alone with a pack of hybrid kids. If Bran were in her position, there was no way in hell he'd let 2 killers stay with him. Because that's what they were. He and Kat both. Killers. No, that's what you were. And now what was he? Just a guy trying to find a place to live where he'd never have to do things he was ashamed of ever again. Shay gazed thoughtfully out the window over Bran's head.
I'm guessing you're pretty curious how I wound up running Miss Shay's home for wayward hybrids.
Is that what you call this place? Bran asked, trying to be diplomatic about it, despite the fact that it made him think maybe Shay wasn't entirely mentally stable. But hell, who was he to judge? But Shay just smirked.
No, that's just an inside joke, between me and myself.
You're right. I'm pretty curious. Now to the really prickly issue. But Bran just had to know, and he was pretty sure he'd already destroyed his chances of staying there, so it was no big loss if he ruffled Shay's feathers a bit. Are they... yours? He'd expected a sharp reaction to that, but Shay just kept staring out the window, and Bran realized there was some pain showing in her eyes, something down deep that she was barely keeping a lid on.
Elijah is. The others aren't.
Bran unearthed a hand from the sheet and rubbed his neck, peering hesitantly at her. But they're all... they're all...
Black?
She shot him a look. He didn't have the balls to confirm that's what he meant, so he just stayed silent. She took a great, bolstering breath.
About 4 years ago, I was in with a group of survivors. We'd started a small settlement, but it wasn't secure. We heard about safer settlements, ones with guard towers and high-voltage fencing to keep the mutants out. We lost several folks before we finally packed up and tried to head for greener pastures. One day, we happened on this place. Weren't planning to do much but stay for a night before continuing on.
She regarded her hands, picking at calloused cuticles.
It was already occupied. A troop of mutants hit us hard and fast. Killed everyone and... God, it seemed like just a few seconds. Everyone except for me and one other woman. They broke her arms and legs. I don't know why. It was like they didn't want to kill her, but they didn't want her getting away either. It didn't matter. She ended up dying anyways. And they were about to do the same to me when
A strange expression came over her, a grim, bitter smirk.
the queen bitch. That's what I called her. She came out and kept them from breaking my arms and legs.
She met Bran's gaze, a feverish sort of interest burning in her eyes.
They're matriarchal, you know? The females, they still have to be careful with the males, but they stick together, and they support the matriarch, the queen bitch, who wasn't a full mutant. I think she was a hybrid, half and half. The other females, the full mutant ones, they protected her, and she protected me.
Full bitterness now, with no humor.
From getting my arms and legs broken anyways. I think
She winced, uncertain.
she was lonely. She kinda took me in and tried to be friends with me, I guess. Was always petting my hair and cuddling up with me.
She shook her head.
But she didn't protect me from the alpha male. And that's where Elijah came from. That's where they all came from. The hybrids here now. From him. From Khan.
Khan? Bran asked, a bit taken aback. Like from the old Star Trek movie? She stared at him blankly for a moment.
No. I thought of him as Khan. It's silly, but he reminded me of the tiger from the Jungle Book.
Bran only distantly recalled watching the animated version as a kid. Couldn't remember the names of the characters. Oh, okay.
Anyways,
Shay breathed out.
something I learned is that these mutant troops, they breed amongst themselves, mutant to mutant, making more mutants, and it don't matter if they come out male or female. But they also breed hybrids, and those, I think they only want those to be female, to make more queens, more matriarchs. Because when Elijah came out a boy, Khan was gonna kill him.
Silence for a long moment. Haunted eyes staring at nothing in particular. Not seeing Bran or Cat or adobe walls, but memories from 4 years ago. After a moment, Shay looked at Cat.
Is that true? I don't even know. Is that how the troops work?
Cat hesitated, then offered a minimal shrug, pointed to her chest.
Raised by humans.
Raised was a generous term for how Bran's former boss had kept Cat. He'd pretty much treated her like a fighting dog. Zero affection and a whole lot of cruelty. Bran leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I can't pretend to know a whole lot about what happens inside these packs, but I think you might be right. Up until I was, greeted by Elijah, I didn't even think the hybrids could be male. I thought they all came out female. But maybe that's just because they kill male hybrids as soon as they're born and only keep the females. Shane nodded slowly.
He was going to kill Elijah, but Queen Bee stopped him, and the rest of the females backed her up. And then they all just left. They left me here, with Elijah.
Shit, Bran murmured, not knowing what else to say. So she'd been held prisoner, more or less, and impregnated by the pack's alpha male, Khan, according to Shay. That was disturbing in the extreme, but it still left Bran wondering. So, how'd you wind up with so many hybrids living here? Shay nodded and straightened.
The troop, Queen Bee's troop, I don't think they went far, because for the first year I'd find food left for me. Parts of animals they'd killed, sometimes fruits. I couldn't nurse Elijah, but he was not a normal baby anyways. So I'd just chew the food and...
She cringed a bit.
Kinda feed him like a baby bird, you know?
Bran just waited for her to continue, an awkward smile on his lips, trying to look like he appreciated her maternal care of Elijah, though he was really kind of grossed out.
That's why I named him Elijah, you know? Reminded me of the story in the Bible where Elijah is kept alive because God would send birds to feed him. Anyways, after a year, my Elijah, not the Bible one, was able to hunt for himself. For both of us, actually. And I learned how to make snares and stuff, live off the land, started a garden here, always with the intention of getting up and moving, but never quite getting around to it. And then one day there was another male hybrid, an infant, left out at the edge of the woods.
She sighed and rolled her hands over each other.
Long story short, best I can figure, Queen Bee's been saving her troops' male hybrids from Khan and leaving them here for me to take care of.
How many are living here with you?
5, including Elijah.
Is she still bringing them around? Shay looked uncertain.
Last one she brought was Jacob, the youngest. That was about 8 or 9 months ago. So